Hi everybody, and welcome to Word Wednesday. On Friday, Jill, my wife, started the day by setting up a little round table, put 4 little stools around it, and then she put a wooden train track around the outside of the table. Then she put the engine, which was made out of wood, and the carriages, also made out of wood, on that track. She set up a high chair, and on the high chair she had rubber utensils that, fork and spoon and so on, but all made out of rubber so that it was safe. Slowly, she just set up the whole environment. Why? Because every Friday we look after our grandson. What she was doing is she was setting up the whole environment with his favourite toys, with the food that he would need, and everything safe, and all the toys that we know he really enjoys playing with. She was creating an environment where it would be safe and enjoyable for our grandson. She was motivated by love. She loves our grandson. And she set up this environment so that he would have everything he could enjoy in that environment. That is a picture of grace. There are scriptures which tell us we are saved by grace through faith. And there are other scriptures that tell us we're to live out the grace. For example, one of these is Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8, where we're told we are saved by grace through faith. It's a gift that God gives us, and it's not our works that do it, so that no man can boast. It's a free gift from God. So what is this grace? Well, that's what you saw there with Jill setting up the environment for our grandson. Everything was there for him to enjoy. And that was all done before our grandson came. God's like that with us. He has, by His grace, set up everything for us. We have total access to everything in there through faith. And it was all done before we actually entered that environment. And just as Jill is motivated by love for her grandson, so God is motivated by His love for all of us. And the ultimate example of that is that He didn't withhold His own Son. Jesus died for us and was raised from the dead because He loves us. So I want to explore this with you tonight in the second letter that Jesus wrote to the Ephesian church. Remember, we tend to think of, there's the book of Samuel and another book by Samuel, or there's a book by Mark in the Gospel, and so on. But actually, the whole Bible was written by one hand. It was written by God, and He co-authored various bits. So we tend to think, Paul wrote a letter to the Ephesians. But actually, that was the first letter to the Ephesians which Jesus wrote, and He co-authored it with Paul. And some years later, he wrote a second letter to the Ephesian church, and he co-authored that one with John. And we find it in the first few verses of Revelation chapter 2. Now, when you look around creation and you see how everything that God has done fits so beautifully together, He has designed everything in a particular way. Doesn't it stand to reason that if He writes 2 letters to one church, not 5, not 3, He's written 2, that the second one would build on the first one? That's just the nature of who He is. You wouldn't think that they'd be completely separate, but instead that they build on each other. And in fact, that's what we do have. The first letter to the Ephesian church mentions the word grace 12 times. So it specifically refers to grace 12 times, but actually grace is woven throughout the entire letter. There are only 3 other books of the New Testament which mention grace as often as the first letter to the Ephesians. And each of those 3 is much larger than the letter to the Ephesians. And it just really shows you that grace is the predominant theme of the letter to the Ephesians, the first letter. And a sub-theme that runs through it is the life of the church. So we are saved by grace through faith, major theme of the first letter of Ephesians, but we live out that grace as individuals and as a church, and that's a sub-theme that strongly runs through that whole first letter. So you would expect that when Jesus then writes a second letter to that same church, that those themes would be evident there again and be built upon. And that's in fact what we do find. Now, before we look at those verses in chapter 2, really we need to look first at the verse immediately before that, which is the last verse of chapter 1. So chapter 1 in Revelation and verse 20. In that verse, we are told something very specific which helps us to understand the letter to the Ephesians which follows. Here we are told in verse 20 that we have a picture of 7 lampstands and of 7 stars. And Jesus explains that the 7 lampstands each represent 7 different churches. And there are then letters to those 7 churches in the next 2 chapters. And he explains that the stars are the angels who represent each of those 7 churches. Now, what's really interesting to note is that the word that's used for lampstands in this verse is menoroth, which is the plural of menorah. To you and me, unless we're Jews, menorah probably doesn't mean very much. But to the Jews, it was a very important object of worship. In Exodus 25, God gives Moses a specific design for 3 items of worship in the temple. Back then, it was a tabernacle, a large tent, and later the Jews built a temple. In that temple, there were only 3 objects of worship. There was an outer courtyard to the temple, and then from that outer courtyard, people went through a curtain into what's known as the holy place. It had walls either side, a curtain that they passed through, and a curtain at the far end. Through that further curtain was the Holy of Holies, and only the high priest could go in there once a year. The people all knew what was behind the curtain, that is the Ark of the Covenant, but only the high priest could go through there once a year. So the 2 objects of worship that the people actually got to see were on the people's side. They saw the table with the bread of presence. So these were 12 loaves of bread that were refreshed every single week, and they represented the 12 tribes of Israel. So that bread on the table represented all of the people. And on the other side, there was this lampstand, menorah. It was 7 lamps, but actually it was 1 lamp. In Exodus 25, where the instructions are given on how to build it, it was to be 1 lampstand with 3 branches. It had an outer branch, so the outer 2 candles were connected as 1 branch. Then the next inner 2 candles, again 1 branch. The next inner 2 candles, again 1 branch, and then there was a center candle. Now, if you imagine this, in the temple, you had the walls, ceiling and floor, and a curtain either side. There's only 1 light in this holy place, and that's from the menorah. If you and I were designing this, we would have it so that the candle diffuses the light in as wide an area as possible, because that's the only source of light for all the worshippers in that area. But that's not the design that God had for the menorah. This menorah had cups on the candles where the light from the candle was that focused the light inward. We see in verse 37 that the effect of this was that the 7 candles shone as one light to what was in front of it. So what you had is the outer candles focusing their light inward so that as one it shone onto the bread on the table of presence. So the light of God shone on all of the people of God. And that is what you had in this holy place, first in the tabernacle and later in the temple. You can imagine they had no internet, no TV, no mobile phones. Worship in the temple was extremely important to them. And although they knew that behind the second curtain was the Ark of the Covenant, really when they went to worship, they just saw 2 things: the bread on the table of presence and the light of God, the menorah. So no wonder that there was so much symbolism in the Jewish culture around the menorah. It was really important to them. And we find at the time of Jesus, some of the literature actually used a menorah structure. So it worked from the outside into the middle, showing the centerpiece. We have one book in the New Testament that actually does this, and that's the Gospel of John, where it's built around 7 I am sayings, and they build on each other into the middle, and the centerpiece says, I am the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. So it's focused in to that center candle. And here in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 20, we're told that each of these churches is a menorah. So effectively we're being told that the letters that come each have 7 parts and they build towards the center. So let's have a look at Revelation chapter 2, the first 7 verses, which is the second letter to the Ephesian church. It starts off with, to the angel of the church of Ephesus write. Now, the angel is representative of the church, and the name of this church is Ephesus. That means desired one. God desires us. He desired us before we desired him. He desires us. Let's skip to the other parallel branch to that, which we find in verse 7. So we're tempted to read it simply from verse 1 through to verse 7. And that's great, you'll get a lot of value out of it. But we're specifically told in chapter 1 verse 20, this is a menorah and should be read like that. And so it's like 2 sides of the same coin. One part of the branch, this is written to the desired one. And then the other part of that branch, it's to the person who is victorious or the person who overcomes. Jesus will reward that person by giving them to eat from the tree of life. Now that's really important here. What's the tree of life? Well, it reminds us of the creation story back in Genesis chapter 1, when God created the heavens and the earth and the universe around us. Think about what he created. Man was created last. Why? Because God first did what my wife Jill did for our grandson. He set up the environment, made sure there was air to breathe, earth to cultivate, fruit and vegetables and so on growing, animals. He provided everything that man needed for our enjoyment, and then put man into the picture. My wife Jill set up the entire environment on Friday for our grandson to enjoy. And only once everything was set up for him to do that, then our grandson came to enjoy that. That's what we have here, the reminder. Remember, there were 2 trees that they were told about in Genesis, and one of those was the tree of life. So by eating from this tree, we have life, now and for eternity. One side of the branch, We are desired by God. The other side of the branch, he wants to spend eternity with us. He not only desires us, but he desires to spend all of eternity with us. But captured in that image as well is that image of grace right from the start. How do we enter into that life? Through Jesus. We are saved by grace through faith because of what Jesus has done for us. So, back in creation, God, by his grace, set up everything for us to enjoy. But the same is true with recreation. We are new creatures in Christ. And before you and I embraced Christ, God set up by his grace, because he loves us, everything we would need to live this life of faith. Just like Jill set up everything for our grandson.
Thank you for joining us for the first half of Live by Grace Through Faith. The second part will premiere next Tuesday at 7:15 on YouTube.